Lando Norris is finally a Formula One Grand Prix winner. That's not a sentence I thought I would be saying today, but here we are. They say F1 is always full of surprises, and today's race definitely was. What a race we had in Miami. I didn't think it was going to deliver a good race, but surprisingly, it managed to do so. And even the sprint race I thought was very, very good. I think the only appropriate place to start here has to be with the winner, Lando Norris. 110 races, I believe it's taken him, and I'm still in shock he managed to win today. For me, the best part of this race win for Norris was that he really had to earn it. This wasn't like he had lucked into a win. Lando had to drive a perfect race to hold off Max Verstappen after the safety car restart on lap 33. Sure, he was given the track position with the safety car, but it's not like it wasn't a fair fight between him and Max. It was, and it wasn't like he had been given this track position around Monaco and then he just parked the bus. No, he managed to drive away from Max and create a 7.5 second gap before they got to the checkered flag. What a job from Lando Norris it was. This win is incredibly well deserved by Lando, and I hope it puts to rest and to bed that narrative that some people like to run, that he has a tendency to bottle winning situations. For me, that narrative is just completely incorrect. I absolutely hate it, and Norris proved today he can capitalize on those opportunities provided to him. So once again, a huge congratulations to Norris. He stuck it out with incredible pace on the first stint, which allowed him to run longer and get the benefit of that safety car. And once again, he had the pace to hold off Max Verstappen at the end, especially in an undamaged Red Bull. So again, congrats to Lando Norris. He 100% deserves this win. Speaking of Verstappen, let's quickly chat about him. He was once again the dominant Red Bull driver over the course of the weekend. He was much quicker, I think, than Perez was, especially in the race when I argue the Red Bull wasn't actually the quickest car we had today on pure race pace. The pace difference between him and Perez was clearly on display again, and that showed in the result where Verstappen managed to finish second and Perez was down in fifth. It wasn't a bad race by Perez by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that gap to Verstappen's exaggerated when the gaps between all the cars are much closer together, but that's saying that it wasn't a great race from him either. The first half of this race until the safety car came out wasn't action-packed. However, the start itself was very chaotic. Verstappen launched away from pole position quite well. He got a very decent launch, but Leclerc got a bad jump from P2. Sainz and Perez from P3 and P4 on the grid both got really good launches, and they went 3 wide into turn 1 with Leclerc in the middle. Here, Perez braked way too late. It was astronomically how late he braked, considering how short the run to turn 1 is at Miami. And he was inches away from taking Verstappen out and smacking Verstappen's rear diffuser and rear tyre. This mistake forced Sainz, Leclerc and Norris to all take evasive action and compromise their runs through turn 1, allowing Piastri to make his way up the field, jumping Perez, Norris and Sainz. And a couple laps later, Piastri even jumped Leclerc under racing conditions, getting himself up to P2. Just imagine the chaos and the implosion at Red Bull that would have occurred if Perez had taken out Verstappen. Fortunately for Perez's sake, he didn't, but the chaos, it just would have been complete chaos. The race then settled into a bit of a rhythm after this stage, with the top order not changing much until the pit stop sequence a bit later in the race. There were some scraps lower down the field though, as the Mercedes had to fight their way past the house of Nico Hülkenberg. A VSC was then called for a bollard that Verstappen hit through the chicane at the backside of the circuit. As he had to cut across, he went wide for the first bit, decided to cut across and just clobbered the bollard with his front wing, which then brought it onto the track on that long back straight. But none of the leaders were anywhere near the pits when the VSC was called, so it didn't affect the race much at all from the leaders' perspective. Lots of midfield drivers pit, but the leaders were on the other side of the track when the VSC was out. By the time they got around to the pits, the VSC was already over, so no one ended up pitting out of that lead group. The pit stop sequence, however, was then started when Perez boxed on lap 18, followed by Leclerc on lap 20. These were relatively early stops in comparison to the drivers around them in order to get an undercut on those drivers that decided to run long. Verstappen then came in on lap 24, which surprised me, given that both McLarens and Sainz were still yet to box at this stage, so there was really no undercut pressure, but I guess it showed that the Red Bulls were struggling with tyre management in this stage of the race. Piastri and Sainz then pitted on lap 28 before the safety car, which was really unfortunate timing. The safety car was caused by Sargent and Magnussen colliding at turn 3 in an incident I would be happy to put down as a racing incident, but Magnussen was definitely more at fault for this incident. Magnussen tried a switchback on Sargent at turn 1, and his front wing was alongside the wing mirror of the Williams going through turn 2. However, by the time they got to turn 3, Sargent was around 3/4 of a car length ahead, and he turned in not really knowing that Magnussen was still there, and that sent him into the barriers, causing him to DNF, and whilst K-Mag continued with some damage to his car. While Sargent definitely could have avoided this incident, I don't think it was up to him to avoid. He could have left K-Mag more space, but I don't think K-Mag deserved more space in this instance. He probably should have backed out, and that's where I would apportion the blame more to Magnussen. I could see it getting put down as a racing incident, given that Sargent could have given Magnussen more space, but I was happy with the steward's decision on this one. But let me know who you think was at fault down below in the comments. This safety car played perfectly into Norris's hands, as he hadn't pitted yet and was able to pit and come back out into a lead, and that was the lead he didn't relinquish for then the rest of the race. The final bit of major on-track action we had during the Grand Prix was the Sainz-Piastri battle, which ended up with Piastri getting a broken front wing. Sainz first attacked Piastri on the run into turn 11, and Piastri ran him wide. Whilst Sainz was a bit incredulous over the radio here, saying that Piastri has to give him the position back, I agree with the stewards that Piastri did nothing wrong in this instance. He kept his car within track limits, he was defending the inside line, and Sainz was the one taking all the risk going around the outside, leaving himself vulnerable to being run wide by the driver on the inside. However, when Sainz next tried his next attack on Piastri on lap 40, he dived down the inside into the final hairpin and just ran too deep. And as Piastri was trying to turn into the corner, he clipped the rear of the Ferrari, breaking his front wing and then causing him to pit. There was just too much damage. And for me, this was completely on Sainz. There was so much room to the apex of this corner. It was clear that he just went deep and missed the apex. And I don't think Piastri could have done much more to really avoid Sainz at this stage. He was clearly a bit annoyed that Piastri had kept the position previously. So I think this penalty is fair enough. And that's basically the race. It was very enjoyable to watch. I enjoyed it. I'll quickly just touch on the sprint race before we go into the top 10 finishes. I thought it was equally as good, to be honest. The first corner collision was the main talking point of the race, and that for me was completely on Hamilton. He did what Perez did in the main race, but escaped without penalty, probably because... Actually, I don't know, because he did make contact with other cars. I don't know how Hamilton didn't get penalised for this incident. He just braked way, way too late. Hit Alonso, hit Stroll, and I think whilst Alonso did hit Stroll first, I think he was seeing what Hamilton was doing and trying to avoid Hamilton at this stage. So that's completely on him, and I don't know how he didn't get a penalty for it. You then had Ricciardo, who really started as he converted 4th into 4th in the sprint race. He drove an outstanding race to keep ahead of Sainz and Piastri. And then you finally had the K-Mag, who was once again conducting a really long DRS train. I appreciate hard racing, but to me, K-Mag just went way too over the top in the sprint. You can't force yourself and another car off the track, and then when rejoining to defend your position, you drive into the side of them. To me, that's not hard racing. That's just dangerous racing and above the limit. It was just a step too far for me, and I agree with the steward's decision to hand out penalties. But overall, though, both races really exceeded my expectations I had. Not that my expectations were high, but they were decent races. I really enjoyed them. All right, my favourite time, let's move on to the top finishes. Obviously, Norris was P1 and Verstappen was P2. I've already talked about them a lot. Both of them drove an outstanding race, so congrats to both of them. Leclerc came home in P3 with Sainz following him home in P4. I honestly think both drivers pretty much maximised today's results. I don't think they were quick enough to challenge Norris and Verstappen, but they were definitely both quicker than the drivers behind. So basically where they should have finished, they finished. Perhaps I expected the Ferraris to be a bit quicker overall though than what they were, but both drivers drove incredibly good races today. And for me, it's the usual story for Perez here down in P5. He did a decent job like he's done for most of the races so far this year, but he's just slower than Max is. So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I feel like these are just the races when the Red Bull isn't at its strongest that Perez is letting down the team in, and you can really see the difference in their pace. So I don't know what to say about Perez at this point. For me, this isn't good enough. I would be looking to replace him. It's fine when the Red Bull's 5/10 ahead of everyone else and his 3/10 gap isn't costing them anything. But when the gaps are much smaller, you can see it's really costing Red Bull. The Mercs of Hamilton and Russell came home in P6 and P8. The Mercedes was just plain slow this weekend. It wasn't even a definite Q3 car for either qualifying sessions. And whilst it was better in race pace, it still wasn't rapid. Both drivers struggled to overtake during the races just because they didn't have the top speed, and they were severely limited by the car. So I think both drivers drove really well this weekend. They just couldn't do any more with the bad car that Mercedes had given them. Yuki Tsunoda, he came home in P7 picking up another nice haul of points this weekend, and it was a complete tale of two halves for the RBs, as Ricciardo was brilliant in the sprint when Yuki struggled with qualifying and making his way through, and then it was vice versa for the main race. It's clear that in order to maximise the RB's performance, you have to qualify well, which both drivers failed to do in one session when the other driver did qualify well. I'd probably rate both drivers the same this weekend, in all honesty, and it's a good solid points haul for the team. It was just pretty funny that one driver would nail qualifying and the other driver wouldn't, and then they would just swap. Anyway. You then have Fernando in P9 and Esteban Ocon in P10. Fernando had a solid race to come from 14th on the grid to then finish in the top 10, but the Aston was just lacking pace this weekend, similar to the Mercedes. Him and Stroll were taken out in the sprint by Hamilton, so it was a poor weekend overall for Aston. The first was not their doing. The second, on having a bad car for the race, was completely their own doing. Ocon was one of those that actually benefited from the safety car coming out. He put on some new tyres and was able to hold his track position after the safety car, and he made the most of that track position, which I think is very important in this instance. Again, these points are crucial for the lower midfield fight and shows that Alpine is in fact actually making improvements to the car, given that I believe this was the first race they were at the weight limit. So very exciting stuff, promising signs for Alpine. Alright, that is your top 10. Let's have a quick chat about the bottom 10 finishes. Haas. So Hülkenberg came home in P11 and Magnussen in P18. The Hulk had a very solid weekend again. The Haas, I don't think, was a points challenging car this weekend, but it was running extremely low downforce, making it extremely difficult for other cars to overtake it in the race. I think Hulk maximised, whilst K-Mag was on a mission to accumulate as many penalty points as possible. I'm just joking, of course, but he was instructed in the sprint to hold up the cars behind, so I understand him getting a couple penalties. He was doing it for the team then, but the collision in the race was his own doing. So it was just another one of those weekends where he just looked second best to Hulk for really most of it. So K-Mag needs to pick it up. Considering that Hulk's actually leaving next year, I would be saying that Behrman would be joining, and if he wants to stay, he needs to improve his performances. Gasly, the other Alpine, came home in P11. His strategy was just ruined by the safety car coming out. But up until then, he was driving a really decent race. They're good signs for Alpine. They're making improvements to the car. They're seemingly getting more competitive as the season progresses, so they just need to continue this upward trajectory, and maybe they will be in a better position come the end of the year, but it's Alpine. It's Renault. So maybe they won't be at all. I guess we'll never know. They might even have a new team principal by the end of the year. Piastri was down in 13th, and it was really a story of what could have been for the Australian. He could have been in a position to win this race if he had stayed out one more lap before he pitted, but instead he got shuffled back down the order because of the safety car. He pitted that lap earlier, and then he got run into by Sainz. A much better weekend pace-wise for Oscar than China, so there's many positives to take out. He'll just be annoyed with that end result. I think he had the pace to win this race. Not saying that I'm not happy Norris won. I'm extremely happy Norris won, but I think Oscar also could have had the pace had things played out a bit differently, and he'll be disappointed not to score any points this weekend or even finish on the podium. He was definitely in contention to finish P3. Both kit cars were just slow again this weekend. Zhou came home in P14, Bottas was down in P16. Again, both drivers I think drove quite well this weekend. That car is just slow. They need to improve it. Needs to get quicker if they want to score more points this year. Actually, they haven't scored any. If they want to score points this year. Daniel Ricciardo was down in P15, and his interesting weekend to discuss. He had more pace in him than what showed in the race. We were shown that in the sprint when he held on to 4th. But his own mistakes in qualifying is what cost him, and he can't blame anyone else apart from him, really. He qualifies well. I'm sure he does better. The RB has great downforce, but lacked straight line speed. So he suffered really badly in traffic, because it couldn't pass any cars through the corners. It would close up, struggle with the dirty air, and then would just drop back in the straights. And this really showed when he tried to overtake Albon. He was 2.5 tenths back going at the start of the really long back straight with the slight kinks in it. And then this opened up to 4 tenths by the time they got to the braking zone, even with Albon starting 9 tenths behind the car ahead of him. So both drivers had DRS. Ricciardo was closer to Albon than Albon was closer to the car ahead by half a second. And the Williams pulled away, which that shouldn't happen because of the slipstream effect, so it just shows that the RB just didn't have the straight line speed to really overtake it all. Both RB drivers, though, have to qualify well if they want to score points. I can't emphasize this enough. That car is much more difficult to get through the field, considering it focuses more on downforce than top speed, so they have to qualify well, which Ricciardo failed to do in the main race, and Tsunoda didn't do in the sprint. Lance Stroll, he was down in P17, suffered because of the safety car coming out. A lot of these midfield drivers either got a better result because of the safety car or got a worse result because of the safety car. It was just a story of two halves again. And on a weekend when the Aston didn't have the pace, he just wasn't going to recover. Alonso just made it into the top 10, so I wasn't expecting Stroll to be doing anything special. He still needs to improve his overall pace, though. It's still lacking in comparison to Fernando. Finally, we get to both Williams finishing down in P19 and B20, a pretty poor end result for Williams. But the car had decent race pace, I think, especially in the hands of Albon. But again, he got screwed by the safety car, which meant he was trying to defend on 20-lap older tyres than everyone else, which then led to his massive lockup on the final laps, which meant he finished like 10 seconds off the back of P18. I don't think there was much more he could have done in this race. He tried his best. Sargent, I also think, had decent race pace. Not as good as Albon's, but it's still decent. And he was unlucky to get taken out by Magnussen in the end. Whilst I don't think points were on the cards for him, a decent result was. And he just needs to string together some decent results at the moment. He just needs to build that confidence. And unfortunately, he's just not getting it together. I don't think he'll be racing next year for Williams, unfortunately. But what can you do? Results speak. Well, I think that about wraps it up for the Miami Grand Prix, the first US Grand Prix of the season out of 3. Once again, I didn't think Miami was going to deliver a good race at all, but it certainly did. Both the sprint and the Grand Prix were very exciting. I enjoyed them both. If I had to rate the Grand Prix out of 10, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. On par with Australia, really. Maybe a bit better than Australia because Verstappen was still in the race. There was decent strategy, and whilst it was difficult to overtake, it could still be done. Something still needs to be done about the surface, though, and the fiddly chicane before the long straight. The surface was so much slower compared to last year for some reason, and I hate that fiddly chicane. The Alpines managed to go side by side through it, actually. I forgot about that. I don't know how they pulled that off. Because it's the most dinky chicane I've ever seen, and it's there because of the overpass. The cars have to be going a certain speed, but it's awful. It just spreads out the cars. Again, I'm still in shock that Alpines managed to get side by side, especially Ocon and Gasly. Crazy times. Anyway, but it was definitely Miami's best race out of the 3 so far. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It's my least favorite US track, but I enjoyed the race. I could appreciate it. So maybe we'll be getting some good races at Miami now. Next up, though, we do have Imola in 2 weeks' time. Not a sprint weekend, back to a normal weekend. And whilst I'm not the biggest fan of Imola, I don't think it should be on the calendar, or it should have some circuit changes. Maybe back to its 1993 layout, with a bit more safety, of course. We don't want any more incidents there, but I think the 1993 layout was better for racing than the current one. Anyway, getting sidetracked. I am excited to go back there, considering last year's race was washed out, and who knows, maybe we will get a decent race. I wasn't optimistic about Miami, but it produced anyway. Hopefully the Red Bull isn't as quick again as it was this week, and we can get some decent racing. Fingers crossed. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't already, let me know what you would rate the race out of 10 down below in the comments. Please let me know if you have any suggestions for this, and of course, have a great rest of your day.